Magnus Carlsen does something in this game that we don't see very often. He gets a knight on the 7th rank. Very rare. This is a real treat. This game is between Grandmaster Salem from the United Arab Emirates and world champion Magnus Carlsen. Grandmaster Salem is 26-28. Magnus Carlsen is 28-30. This is the Mr. Dodgy tournament. What a name on chess.com. 5 minutes for each side and no increment. So this is critical stuff. Grandmaster Salem has white. Magnus Carlsen has black. Let's jump right in. The Grandmaster begins with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, d5. So Carlsen plays a Queen's Gambit, declined, and Grandmaster Salem plays the exchange variation, bishop g5, c6, e3, bishop e7 to relieve the pin, bishop to d3. Now in this position, white has two main strategies. This is a Carlsbad pawn structure, and his first strategy is to play the minority attack. Take the pawn at b2, play it to b4, b5, and try to create a weakness on black's queen side. The other strategy is to play in the center, to play f3 and e4 and advance centrally. And you usually know what white's going to do depending on what he does with the g1 knight. h6, bishop h4, and castles. And here Grandmaster Salem plays the knight to e2, which indicates he's looking to play the f3, e4 strategy. If instead he had played the knight to f3, then the minority attack strategy would probably be more likely. So after knight ge2, Magnus plays knight to e8, offering an exchange of bishops, but also wants to bring the knight to d6 so it can control c4 and e4. White says, I don't want to trade, I want material, I want to attack. That's why I'm advancing in the center, so I want to keep that bishop on the board. The knight goes to c6, queen to c2 to help keep e4 under control and also creates pressure against black's king. Rook to e8, castles, and bishop to f8. This is a very standard reorganization for black. The rook is on the e-file, helps control e4. The bishop can aid in the defense of the king. Rook a to e1. Now, moving the rook to e1 when there's a knight and a pawn right in front of it may not make a lot of sense, but basically he wants to make sure the e3 pawn is defended. When he plays the pawn to f3 later, the e3 pawn will not be defended anymore, so he places a rook at e1 so that that rook will be well positioned both to defend the pawn and support its advance later. a5, expanding on the queen side, and the novelty of the game, a knight to d1. I think his idea is this. He wants to, again, it helps defend e3. The knight can also go to f2 and reroute to the king side, and he doesn't want black to gain a tempo with b5, b4. Black has been playing very aggressively with the queenside pawns in this opening recently, and this means he doesn't have to worry about the knight getting kicked away later. The knight goes to a6. Magnus would love to hop into b4, attack the queen and the bishop, and get that light-squared bishop off of the board, so a3 keeps the knight out. Bishop to d7, defends c6, and also prepares the move b5, so the pawn at c6 would not hang. Now f3. So Grandmaster Salem begins his strategy. He wants to push through with e4 and gain space through the center of the board and utilize that for a kingside attack. And Magnus plays rook to c8. His idea, he wants to play c5. The last thing you want white to be able to do in this position is just to advance the pawns peacefully without any resistance in the center. You need to keep things sharp in the center so white can't be comfortable. And his idea is to play c5, so he places the rook opposite the queen. Queen to d2 is not a bad option. He could move the bishop back to b1, maybe play queen to d3 and aim at the h7 square, but instead Grandmaster Salem plays knight e to c3. The idea is to move the queen over to f2, and then when he plays e4, if the center opens up, the queen would be aiming right at the f7 square. c5 is played, the queen goes to f2. It also can support a bishop's push to h5. Bishop to c6 to defend the d5 pawn, which was under threat from the knight. And now b5, bishop f4, and b5 is played by black. Another strong idea is knight to c4, nibbling on e3 and b2. It's a very annoying place for white to face a knight. But b5 is played, just advancing his pawns, again threatening to kick away the knight at c3. The knight goes to e2. Computers like this idea for white. Bishop takes knight, queen takes, and then grabbing the pawn at b5. White gains a pawn, but it's basically equal because black has dynamic compensation. But a human being really never does this because it's a total distraction from their plan. Computers don't worry about plans, human beings do. So humans would never do this, even though the computers say it's the best. Instead, he moves the knight to e2. This knight can be, again, rerouted to the king side for attack. The knight goes to c4. The knight goes to c4. And here, Magnus is already threatening to play knight to d2, which would win an exchange. The f1 rook has nowhere to go, so he could just plop the knight in, win the f1 rook. Queen to g3 gives the rook some room, but also pins the g7 pawn and threatens bishop takes h6. The bishop cannot be taken because the pawn would be pinned. So Magnus deals with that by playing h5 and avoids the bishop h6 idea. A better move may have been king to h8, however. h5, and here a strong move for white is bishop to g5. It aims at the queen. After, say, bishop e7 and exchanging queens, then knight to f4. And white has the beginning of a fairly effective attack. He's threatening to take on h5, and g6 won't help because there would be a pin, and white could just take the h5 pawn. So white's getting a nibble here. But instead, he plays the move queen to h3, directly aiming at the h5 pawn, and now g6. And Magnus's king is fairly well defended at the moment. He can't be careless, but he's doing okay. So white has to get at that king to have any counterplay, so he plays g4. He wants to open up that line, maybe move the king over, move the rook over, and get in. So Magnus plays bishop to d7, pinning the g4 pawn to the queen. The queen moves out of the pin, and now this move, h4. He basically bypasses the pawn so that white cannot open any lines of attack leading to black's king. g5, trying to artificially isolate this pawn on h4, maybe play the queen f2, take it this way. Bishop to g7, aiming at the vulnerable d4 point. King to h1. Now knight to d2. Magnus gets a knight all the way to the 7th rank, something you rarely see, and it's hard to believe that it can't be captured, but it can't be. There's nothing that can take it, and he's attacking the rook at f1, so that move rook moves to g1. c4 is played. He's beginning to advance these queenside pawns. He gains a tempo on the bishop. The bishop moves to c2 and b4. So he's got this 3-2 majority on the queen side, and it's making a lot of progress here. And the computer's like this move, knight to c1. It's a defensive and passive move. It's not something humans like to play, but it attacks the knight at d2 and would be a way to play on. But in this position, Grandmaster Salem decides to play e4. And unfortunately, he's chosen perhaps the worst time possible to do this. He's going to weaken his light squares quite badly here. c3 was played by Magnus. It turns out he can just take on e4. And after pawn takes, he just takes the pawn with his knight. And if the bishop takes, he just takes the bishop with the rook. And if the queen takes rook, bishop to c6 would pin the queen to the king. And this is on the board for quite a while. After c3, pawn takes, he plays b3, but again, de4 is best. The bishop moves to d3, and now knight takes f3. Again, weakening those light squares. And in this position, if queen to f3, then just de4, forking the queen and the bishop. And if bishop takes e4, again, you just take with the rook, queen takes, and then bishop to c6. You still get the pin on the queen to the king. So instead, white plays bishop takes a6, capturing the knight and threatening the rook at c8. Knight to e1, takes the rook, but also attacks the queen on g2. Rook takes knight, rook e1. Rook takes e4. Bishop takes c8. Queen takes c8. And now knight to f2, attacking the rook at e4. The rook goes to e8, and now knight to d3. So this knight can go to e5, c5, or it can blockade on b2. And Magnus plays bishop to f5. He wants to get in to the queen side. And here, if white plays knight to c5, right, so you can control this square, then just b2. And the bishop and the pawn coordinate, and white has to give up far too much material. So in this position, he blockades on b2, which is really his only choice. And then, boom, bishop to e4, pins the queen to the king, and Magnus wins. Even after going over this great game from Magnus Carlsen, there's still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to see is in this video right here. So be sure to catch that to see some really mind-blowing chess.